All righty, folks. Welcome, welcome, welcome. As I said, I'd like to inform you that we are recording this special webinar. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to Avis Koyman and Srushti Suresh for all their assistance behind the scenes that make this and all other events possible. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today for a special webinar titled The Future of U.S. Israel Defense Cooperation and Trump's Second Term as President, featuring a trio of top policy experts, Shoshana Bryan, Michael Eisenstadt, and Jonathan Lord, whom I'll present in a few seconds. I'd like to mention that our next special webinar is a book talk titled Ghost of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict, featuring the award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer, Yardena Schwartz. The online event will take place on Wednesday, March 12, between 6 and 7:30 p.m. Eastern. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. Now, while today's webinar was scheduled months ago, it could not be timelier and more relevant today. Since the second inauguration of President Donald Trump, both the Middle East and the defense establishment have been experiencing some major dramatic changes. On the one hand, during their first meeting in the White House only a few weeks ago, President Trump announced his plans for the future of the Gaza Strip, which Benjamin Netanyahu said, yes, please. On the other hand, this past Friday, Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Charles Brown Jr., as well as multiple other senior military officers. There are reports that this is not the end of what some called the Pentagon Purge, that so far included the removal of Admiral Lisa Franchetti, General James Slife, the Vice Chief of the Air Force, and the top lawyers for the Navy, Army, and Air Force. What do these developments say about the Trump administration's defense policies in general, and in the context of the future of U.S. Israel defense cooperation? Is there any connection at all? Is Trump's first term in office a viable roadmap for understanding what the future holds, or are we witnessing something completely different? I do not think that we could ask for a more experienced and knowledgeable trio of policy experts, as I say, to help us answer these and other related questions. It is truly, deeply, really an honor and pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Their bios are as remarkable and impressive as they are extensive, so I will merely highlight a few key pieces of information about each speaker, but I would strongly, strongly encourage you to look them up online and appreciate the scope and depth of their work on these matters. First, Shoshana Bryan is the Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center and editor of In Focus Quarterly. She's a leading specialist in U.S. defense policy and Middle East affairs, and the former Executive Director and Senior Director for Security Policy at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. She has worked with the Strategic Studies Institute of the United States Army War College and the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and lectured at the National Defense University here in Washington, D.C. Michael Eisenstadt is the Kahn Senior Fellow and Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Military and Security Studies program. He's a specialist in Persian Gulf and Arab-Israeli security affairs and has published widely on irregular and conventional warfare and nuclear weapons proliferation in the Middle East. Before joining the Institute in 1989, Mr. Eisenstadt worked as a military analyst with the U.S. government. He also served for 26 years as an officer in the U.S. Army Reserve before retiring in 2010. Last but not least, Jonathan Lord is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a Neo-American Security. Before joining the center, Lord served as a professional staff member for the House Armed Services Committee, serving the full committee and managing the U.S. Central Command, as well as Middle East defense policy portfolio. Lord previously served as the Iraq Country Director in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and as a political military analyst in the Department of Defense. We are structuring this webinar slightly differently, as I told the speakers earlier. Each will have about 10 minutes to present their key takes on the topic based on their own work and experience. Then I'll moderate a more conversational exchange based on the comments that they made, as well as the questions from the audience. I hope we can get our speakers to respond to their peers' remarks, but I will also throw a question or comment, of course. To the members of the audience, please feel free to type those questions in the designated Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, Shoshana Bryan, my friend, the virtual floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much. I'm starting because I'm starting from the past, and the present comes from the past. There are two streams in U.S. Israel security relations, the political stream and the military stream. There are also two streams in the security stream, the military as such, and the DoD civilian stream. They function differently, and at times they are at odds, and you've seen a lot of that. The military stream actually began in 1983 when Ronald Reagan and Yitzhak Shamir announced something called U.S. Israel Strategic Cooperation. I held a meeting of American security professionals at the time to see what they thought about the idea. They thought Israel was a really nice country and a friend, but not very useful in the region. On the other hand, probably because I beat them over the head, they spent 2 days creating a grid of capabilities the United States lacked in the region and thinking about the ways Israel could fill that gap. Their report became the working document of the U.S. delegation to the first strategic cooperation talks in 1984. One of the things they saw that intrigued them was an Israeli surveillance drone flying over Lebanon in 1982. I actually saw that footage in 1982. It was a car that was stopped by a man with a gun, and he reached inside and pulled out the passenger and killed him on the side of the road. The drones came from an Israeli model airplane flying club because there were no actual drones, but the Americans wanted them. And the U.S. Army was working on them, and the Israeli military was working on them. And that was the beginning of the understanding that Israel had something to offer to the West, something serious. Today, Israel's weaponry and technology is in high demand, even from European countries, and even as they condemn Israel and its use of its own defenses in Gaza or on the West Bank, they're still buying it. Since then, Israel has been understood by the American military stream as a security producer in the region. That is a country by virtue of which a region is more secure. On the other side are security consumers, weak countries that need security producers in order to stay alive. Now, that's something to keep in mind in a few minutes when I get to the Trump administration, because you can't do history forever, right? So the Abraham Accords were signed in late 2020, and one incentive for the Gulf states, which are concerned about Iran in the region, was to have Israeli participation in their defense. So as part of the deal, Israel entered U.S. CENTCOM in January of 2021, engaging with the U.S., but also engaging with our regional allies and partners, specifically those moderate Arab countries. General Kurilla, the CENTCOM commander, visited Israel 8 times between his ascension to the post in April 2022 and August of 2023. He went in October of 23, and he's been there 7 times since. Once right after the fall of Bashar Assad in Syria, and most recently this month. The advantage for the U.S. is a really strong, committed military in the Red Sea and able to operate in the Persian Gulf against Iran. The second benefit is increased access to Israel's weapons. For Israel, the advantage is missile defense, among other things, under a single command structure, making command and control more predictable and more dependable. For example, a U.S. Aegis-capable destroyer can spot a launch over the Persian Gulf and pass targeting information to the Arrow system in Israel, as well as targeting missiles itself. And you saw that when Iran launched 200 rockets and missiles at Israel last year, and the U.S. and CENTCOM responded jointly to the attack, including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, I mean, things that I never in my life thought I would see. But because it was all under a single command and control, it worked. Now, there's always a downside, and that's the political military stream entering the picture. Israel's reliance on U.S. military supplies was a liability after October 7th. The U.S. made military demands on Israel about how to carry out the war and threatened to withhold and did slow down and withhold weapons if Israel didn't comply. Secretary of State Blinken, for example, had 3 demands of Israel. He is not a military thinker. He's not even a civilian in the Department of Defense, but he said, number one, Israel should use smaller bombs to try to protect Gaza civilians. The IDF should use small teams of commandos with UAVs to better protect the Gaza civilians. And the IDF should engage in humanitarian pauses to deliver supplies to the Gaza civilians. So you can see the end game was different. The goal was different. And then the administration told Israel, don't do this and don't do that and don't do the other thing. So you say, what difference does it make? Biden's gone. Trump is here, clearly more attuned to Israel's policies. Why do we care? Well, first, because Israel learned a lesson during the Gaza war about relying on the U.S. You will see more domestic production for the IDF, specifically heavy bombs and raw material manufacturing. Doesn't make much difference now, but it may have an impact on joint production in the future. And Israel isn't worried now, but they are worried about what follows the Trump administration. Second, the Trump administration is aligned politically with Israel on the two fundamental points. Hamas has to be destroyed and Iran can't go nuclear. But how are they and we going to achieve those objectives? How much does the U.S. administration expect Israel to do? How much will the U.S. do? How much is CENTCOM's responsibility? How much is the IDF's responsibility? We don't know, but we do have a clue. And so I'm going to close with this thought. This is where security producers and security consumers become important. The U.S. wants NATO to be a security producer in Europe, to take the reins of European security, to finance itself, to run its own operations in its own space. NATO is, however, presently a security consumer. Doesn't have the capability, doesn't have the money, doesn't have the will, and it prefers to stay that way. So you see the argument that's brewing right now between the Trump administration and the Europeans. On the other hand, the U.S. looks at the Pacific, which is full of security consumers. But when we look at the Pacific, the administration's view is that they cannot do it themselves. They cannot face China themselves. That has to be our obligation, to lead on China. But it's hard to do if we're doing Ukraine and NATO and Europe and the Middle East. So Israel is a security producer in the Middle East. How much, how big, how capable remains to be seen. And that's, in my opinion, where we stop today. It's where we are.
Thank you so much, Shoshana Bryan, for starting this conversation, for getting this ball rolling. We now turn to Michael Eisenstadt. How do you see the current state of affairs? Is there something historical there, as Shoshana said, or something else? Go ahead, my friend, please.
I'd like to also start off like Shoshana and build on some of her comments with kind of a historical anecdote. So I was in college in the second half of the 70s, and I remember that period. That was the aftermath of the October 73 war. Israel was taken by surprise, just like the most recent war. And the war was fought to pretty much, although I think Israel claimed victory, it was a disappointing outcome in many ways for Israel. And there's also the perception that perhaps the long-term balance of power in the Middle East was changing. You had the Arab oil embargo, you had the quadrupling of oil prices, and oil producers like Saudi Arabia and Iraq were building up their militaries as a result. And there was a concern, I think, at that time that the long-term trends in the Middle East were working against Israel. Within a few years, however, you had the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, Egypt emerging as a U.S. ally, Iraq, which had built up its military significantly in the aftermath of the 73 war, then attacked Iran after the Iranian Revolution, and you had this 8-year bloody war between two countries that saw Israel as a major enemy. Then you saw the Saudis, who were building up their military, emerge in '82, forwarding the Arab peace plan, which clearly was unacceptable to Israel at the time, but did talk about the possibility of accepting Israel. So Saudi Arabia was, whatever shortcomings the peace plan might have, was clearly presenting itself as a country that was willing to accept Israel's existence under certain conditions in the future. So you had a dramatic change within the span of just a few years in Israel's position in the region. But yet and looked like, while it looked like the U.S. Israel relationship at the time might have been threatened, you had a reassessment after the 73 war between, with Henry Kissinger kind of holding up arms supplies and the like. The relationship has gone strength to strength. Now, let's go back to the last year and a half or so. You had a period for about the first 10 months after October 7th, where Israel looked like it was mired in a conflict in Gaza, not doing so well, perhaps prevailing, but a very long slog, dealing with Hezbollah to the north, the threat of Iran from the east. And then suddenly, within the period of a few weeks in August and September, turning things around, although with American help. Now, what happened is the Americans provided assistance for Israel's defense against Iranian attacks in April and October. And that was a major change. It was kind of the first time that the United States had kind of overtly come to Israel's assistance in wartime in such a way. I mean, it was the product of several years of planning, and it was a major accomplishment and a major achievement, because it was a success in both April, to a lesser extent in October, but still a major success in both times, fending off the Iranian strikes. However, it was also kind of a major kind of sign that, whereas in the past, the Israelis had always said, we don't want Americans fighting on behalf of Israel, this was really the first case that Israel needed. It was not the first case where Americans actually had served in Israel. I think in 91 and 2003, you had missile defense units deployed to Israel. But you had, in a much bigger way, you had air and ground units providing air and missile defense for Israel, which is really kind of a sign of the times. As you know, I want to just kind of related to Shoshana's comment that the challenges the U.S. faces today, it cannot face on its own anymore. It needs capable allies. And likewise, Israel is facing challenges, at least in the case of Iran, that it cannot deal with completely on its own. So this is kind of, in a way, kind of a sign of, I think, things to come in the relationship between the United States and Israel. If you look at the whole debate now about preventive action against Iran with the Trump administration, and I think what's remarkable that each administration, although there has been, tensions in almost every administration between Israel and the United States, the relationship overall has gone from strength to strength and only gotten deeper and stronger over time. And I think this might be in some ways the most pro-Israel administration in history. Although again, it's kind of early to tell, and we'll have to see. Now, the president has made it clear that he would prefer a new agreement with Iran that covers nuclear and other issues. The Israelis believe that they have a window of opportunity to strike at Iran at this time. It's not clear how this will work out. The president clearly is averse to the use of force. On the other hand, I'll just note, first of all, he had been the target in the past of assassination attempts. That might influence his calculus in the future. Plus, 5 of the last 6 presidents, all of them wanted to get out of the Middle East and avoid Middle Eastern conflicts, and all were eventually dragged in some way or another. So it's quite possible, even though the president right now, seems averse to the idea of preventive military action, if diplomacy doesn't achieve an agreement that he can live with, I don't rule out that possibility. I'll also just say that there is concerns that he might eventually conclude an agreement that really is not much different than JCPOA, and kind of give it his own name and say it's 10 times better and the greatest agreement of all time. And so there's this fear that you might have an outcome that is, from an Israeli, and I would argue maybe an American point of view, is undesirable. In terms of future challenges, I'll just make a few points. Israel, again, going back to kind of my childhood and time in college, Israel at that time, it was their exports were diamonds and Jaffa oranges. And they suffered from maybe not hyperinflation, but very high inflation, over 100% many years. Now, Israel is a kind of an economic powerhouse, although the war in Gaza and against Hezbollah has affected the Israeli economy, but they're an engine of high-tech innovation, very important partner for many American industries. Many American high-tech firms have kind of research centers in Israel. So Israel is very important from the point of view of America's economy. And that's especially for this administration, that will be very important. It's important for any administration, but especially for this one where you have so many businessmen. There's also the question of, has the relationship peaked? If you look at polling data with regard to especially young people today and their attitudes towards Israel, older people still are very, very pro-Israel. Still, even young people trend towards pro-Israel, but you have a much greater percentage which is pro-Palestinians. Now that might change. Again, Churchill said, if you're not a socialist when you're 18, you have no heart, and if you're not a conservative by 40, you have no brain. So I won't say that's necessarily. I don't know if I agree with that or not, but I think there is a tendency for people when they get older to change in their worldview. So it's quite possible that this might not be a long-term trend. And I also think there'll be pushback against universities and professional associations that have been activists, have taken an activist bent in recent years. Especially this administration is going to come down very hard in this regard. And I think they should, because I think the problem is it's not just anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism, it's anti-Americanism in many ways. It's anti against the fundamental system we have in this country of kind of liberal democracy. And we already are, I think we're seeing signs of a broader backlash among the population when people just can't, just don't understand what's going on in some of the campuses in the country. There's also the issue of Israel's social cohesion, which has been tested as a result of growing political tribalism in Israel and growing polarization, something we've seen in this country. And this is, we all know from Jewish history, this is proven to be a fatal trait of the Jewish people, and it led to tragedy in the first Commonwealth, when you had even before the monarchy, in the wanderings in the desert, and then with the establishment of the monarchy and the split between Israel and Judah, the split between Hellenizers and traditional Jews, and then Kamsa and Bar Kamsa under the Romans, baseless hatred and political tribalism, and also traditional tribalism, has been poison in the system of the Jewish body politic. And it's just this is something I'm concerned about for Israel in terms of social solidarity, which also has bearing on Israel's appeal as a strategic asset. But I'll also, for my final comment, I'll turn the coin on its around and say this is also a problem that we have here now. And I'm worried, if you look at the run-up to October 7th, it was preceded by 10 months of internecine conflict in Israel. And if you remember, the Defense Secretary or Minister of Defense Gallant gave a speech in March, I think it was, of 2023, warning that that Israel still had enemies, and that the divisions in Israeli society might invite attacks from their enemies. And he turned out to be very prescient. And I'm very worried right now that some of the chaos we're seeing in America at this point might convince some of our adversaries that this might be the time to test the United States. I don't know whether it's China in the Taiwan Straits. I don't know whether it's North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. But again, Israel has benefited from a kind of a generally benign environment where it could rely on the United States to support it and come to its assistance when it's needed it, during the recent war, for instance. But if the United States gets drawn into a conflict in Asia as a result of our internal conflicts, which convinces our enemies that this is the time to strike, this could really pose real challenges to Israel and the U.S. Israel relationship, and Israel's ability to deal with some of the challenges it faces. So on that, I conclude, and I look forward to John's comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. A lot to think about, certainly a lot to relate to. Jonathan Lord, the floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead, please.
Dr. Eli Saltzman, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. To my fellow panelists, Shoshana, Michael, it's a pleasure to hear your comments on the issue and to be here with you. I admit I've been following these issues less than either of you. In some cases, I might be alive less than either of you have been following these issues, but I will do my best to keep up. I think where I might be able to inject some value here following on Shoshana and Michael, based off of my Hill experience in the Armed Services Committee, I can talk a little bit about the nature of the U.S. Israel relationship, and the question of bipartisanship or partisanship, and the impact I think that creeping partisanship is having on our foreign policy more broadly, but increasingly, unfortunately, on the tone and tenor of the U.S. Israel relationship. First, the good news. I think, and I have friends in probably both Republican and Democratic camps who would both criticize me for this comment, but I think there is a very significant bipartisan through line in U.S. foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East, and it remains so today. Central to that bipartisan policy, the firmament of it, is the U.S.-Israel relationship. But looking just beyond the U.S.-Israel relationship, that has extended now in both Democratic and Republican administrations recently to include Israel's integration into the region. The Trump administration worked on the Abraham Accords. The Biden administration attempted to follow that up with a Saudi normalization deal, which was upended by October 7th. I would also argue that it has been a central tenet of most, or I would say now actually all, U.S. administrations in recent years, recent decades, to attempt to find a resolution to the to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And even on issues that are seemingly more fraught, more contentious, and certainly more partisan, now speak of Iran, fundamentally, the objective of Democratic and Republican administrations that Iran, in no uncertain terms, is not going to be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, conveys between parties. So that's the good news. I think, fundamentally, the United States is more able to make intelligent, responsive foreign policy decisions when they are made in a bipartisan way. I have seen the issue of partisanship creep from the domestic into the foreign policy. And then, unfortunately, now increasingly in the last couple of years, though it didn't begin in the last couple of years, into the U.S.-Israel space. Some key considerations, again, going back to the good side, is that for me, as a former House Armed Services staffer who worked on the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a bipartisan bill that has passed the U.S. Congress and been signed into law over 60 times, and which is very much historically a compromise piece of legislation and garners broad support in the Congress as a compromise piece of legislation. Israel is always very well represented in the legislation. And even if you go back just a couple years to, I guess, what would have been the fiscal year 2024 NDAA, and for me, the NDAA is really a barometer of what the center out holds. There is still a tremendous amount of bipartisan support for Israel in the U.S. Congress. I think there were no fewer than 9 sections in that bill, and not just all talky talk, some operative bill language in there providing meaningful security assistance to Israel. And most of those provisions were authored before October 7th, and then they were negotiated in conference in the months after. So I think it's a pretty good sort of bellwether for even before and after. Now, increasingly, however, I am concerned that Israel is being discussed more and more in partisan terms. And the end result, unfortunately, like so many partisan wedge issues, it risks an incredibly important strategic relationship with the United States and the Middle East becoming yet one more political football in Washington. And it's not there yet, but the signs to me are increasing. I think I'll give one example. If you roll back the clock to the weeks after October 7th, the Biden administration asked the U.S. Congress for a fairly broad defense supplemental for the support of Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan. Most of the support was for defense expenditures here in Washington that would create munitions, and some of which ostensibly would be then given to our partners over the course of multiple different types of authorities that the president has, and over time. Now, you'll remember that there were two competing bills going forward. The Senate was working on a bipartisan compromise that largely reflected the president's request. And what came out of the House under Speaker Mike Johnson at the time was a sort of a uniparty, partisan version, which was only focused on Israel support and contained fiscal offsets. Now, I actually wrote about this in Times of Israel way back then. My concern about that is that Speaker Johnson understood that there was no way his bill could ever pass. And yet he brought it anyway. And sitting here, and again, I work at a bipartisan think tank. I have worked not as a political, but I've worked inside the first Trump administration. I've worked with Democrats and Republicans on the Hill. As I read that language and listen to his speech at the time, my concern is that because it is increasingly bipartisan, there's a willingness from individuals. Then it was the Republicans. Tomorrow it could be the Democrats to politicize U.S. support to Israel. And the reason I say this is if you look at the bill, it provided financial support for Israel, and Israel alone didn't touch Ukraine, didn't touch Taiwan, and then included a financial offset by cutting the IRS. Now, the argument was made at the time that members wanted to vote separately on Israel and support to Ukraine and Taiwan, and that's a perfectly legitimate argument. And I can understand wanting to bring those bills up separately. Members may have different feelings, particularly on the Republican side, about supporting Ukraine versus supporting Israel versus supporting Taiwan. I understand. If you're a fiscal hawk, perhaps you don't believe any aid should go out without a fiscal offset. Now, I may disagree with that, but again, philosophically, I respect the position. And understanding that you want to basically keep any bill budget neutral. Again, in the case of emergency aid to Israel, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that position, but I respect it philosophically. Now, where I jump off the train here is when that fiscal offset is to the IRS, and then the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan organization with the Congress, actually scores your bill as increasing the debt. Well, then that's basically a poison pill, which is going to push Democrats off support and actually doesn't achieve your aims of being financially conservative. So what are we doing here? Things like that, to me, I look for, and it worries me. The rhetoric that was raised about the Biden administration, even a little bit on this call in Shoshana's remarks, and with all respect, I do think that it's infused, unfortunately, with sort of this common, increasingly refrain of partisanship that we talk about with foreign policy. I mean, understanding that Secretary Blinken and the president himself had concerns about ensuring that U.S. weapons are used in accordance with international law, as is written into U.S. law and is actually required in all U.S. transactions of foreign military assistance, not just Israel. It sort of overlooks the fact that President Biden was the first sitting U.S. president to visit Israel at a time of war. It overlooks the fact that he, in emergency support, provided Israel in the course of a year over $7 billion of military aid and advice. And then, of course, there is the other roughly $13 million of support that comes as a result of sort of the longer arc foreign military financing support, which doesn't arrive on Israel's doorstep, in the next week, but is going to be ultimately delivered over the course of years. And again, I don't say that from a partisan perspective. I say that as someone who wants to recognize that irrespective of politics, the U.S. Israel relationship is strong and was well represented by President Biden, as it continues to be by President Trump. So I want to just push back a little bit and disagree with some of the characterizations of the Biden administration support. Similarly, as we look to the region and Israel's integration, the course of the last 18 months have created a strategic reordering of the Middle East, which has weakened Iran immensely, has ultimately given Israel enormous opportunity. There are opportunities now potentially for non-aggression. And again, you know, this is somewhat off, but I mean, the pathway is potential for non-aggression between Israel and Syria, better relations between Israel and Lebanon, some sort of day after strategy, which fundamentally changes the calculus in the West Bank and Gaza and closes what have been poorly governed and poorly secured spaces that Hamas, with the support of Iran, and even unaffiliated groups have been able to fill to sow chaos. So there's a tremendous moment here where the current U.S. administration, the Trump administration, can take advantage of in coordination with Israel to continue down the path of these sort of long-term, longitudinal, bipartisan objectives, which involves securing Israel, ensuring the U.S. Israel relationship remains strong, and Israel's continued integration in the region, as well as moving towards a better outcome in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So I do see a degree of hope. At the same time, I don't think you can sort of in a binary way look at the different theaters in which the United States is engaged and say more support here, less support there. The adversaries of the United States, in many respects, have become the adversaries of Israel and other small L liberal democracies, such that when the IDF went into southern Lebanon, 70% of the military weapons they found in Hezbollah storage facilities were Russian kit that had flown by way of through on the ground, or in some cases by air, from Iran through Syria. The types of coordination and support that the Iranians and Russians have been engaged in, including the Russians providing lethal intelligence and training to the Houthis, the production and co-production of UAVs, I have argued, will not just have repercussions for our partners in Europe, but will absolutely be deleterious for Israel's security and those of our partners in the Gulf as well. So we have to think about how these adversaries, what we at CNAS refer to as the axis of upheaval, Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, have worked together in the economic space and in the military space, and what that means for our interests, not just regionally in those respective theaters, but globally as well. And the question for me isn't one of who's a producer or a consumer of security, but how do we animate our partnerships and alliances around the world in support of U.S. interests against this axis? And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, again, irrespective of party. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, folks. You can join us. So unmute yourself. I envision this part as a conversation because there's a lot of things that one can say based on or in response to what the others said previously. Shoshana was first. In a way, Jonathan kind of pushed back and said, well, all in all, Biden was extremely supportive. There's no basis for this claim that he was anti-Israel or subverting or undermining Israel during the past year and a half plus. Do we see, was this schism, so to speak, meaningful, or was it just semantics or just?
Look, okay, I never said he was anti-Israel, but I will point out that when he went to Israel, and this is from a briefing that Jake Sullivan gave, Sullivan told the White House press briefing that President Biden reassured Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, quote, "I am for the defeat of Hamas. At the same time, I believe that to get to that, you need a strategy that works, and that strategy should not involve major military operations." So it's not anti-Israel. It's a different focus in the region. Sullivan himself said in the same press briefing that his view as National Security Advisor, it would lead to more innocent civilian deaths, worsen an already dire humanitarian crisis, deepen the anarchy in Gaza, and isolate Israel internationally. More importantly, said Sullivan, the key goals Israel wants to achieve in Rafah can be done by other means. So no, that's not anti-Israel. That's a different view. And that's where the military political stream and the military stream are different and sometimes at odds. And I would say one other thing, Jonathan, I would never engage for 1 minute, half a minute, 7 seconds, the thought that Israel didn't use those weapons under the terms of international humanitarian law. Never for a second. I will say the normal civilian to military ratio of deaths in modern warfare is 9 civilians to 1 military person. In Gaza, you have 1.7 civilian deaths to 1 military death. It is the most cautious military operation I can imagine. So that whole thing about international humanitarian law, just I throw that out. Sorry.
Thank you so much. That's a very good clarification for the comment that I made earlier.
And
Jonathan,
I would
please
actually, I think Shoshana, on this point, we're in violent agreement. I mean, the considerations that Israel had in urban fighting here make U.S. operations in Mosul look simple by comparison. So I have no disagreement with you on your characterization of Israel's performance in the conflict. So yeah, but just as a point of fact, there are the laws of armed conflict as understood by the U.S. And there are other export controls sort of accrue and carry with U.S. defense sales and foreign military articles going, irrespective of whether we're talking about Israel or anyone else. So that was the only point I wanted to make.
So I say, Jonathan, 7 seconds. I would give it 7 seconds. That's it.
Michael, your take on this. Is this a reflection of diverging security interest? If we kind of zoom out just for a bit, is the United States looking at the Middle East differently from a security defense perspective than Israel does? Obviously, they are there. They're kind of entrenched there. But is there something more than that?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of obvious points. I mean, first, I think, we were in, with regard to some of the advice that came from some of the they had delegations that went over there before the war of U.S. generals trying to share some of our experience from Iraq and Syria. There's a tendency for everybody to kind of to see, each situation in terms of the last war and their own experience. I think a lot of the advice that was given to the Israelis by the United States was often not very good, though it was based on an American understanding. You had also like David Petraeus, General Petraeus on TV talking about clear hold build, which and people talk about hearts and minds, which are just totally irrelevant to the kind of the context of Gaza. So I'm kind of glad that by and large the Israelis tended to ignore American advice for many of the critical issues for American reasons. Okay. But that said, I think and I don't want to get into the whole Israeli domestic politics thing here, but there's no doubt that the war was also influenced by political considerations that were not related necessarily just to battlefield considerations related to coalition maintenance by Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as perhaps again, I can't know what his personal calculus. There were accusations by some Israelis that his own, personal, political, calculus entered into matters. So I think I think it's very plausible because you can't separate politics from strategy. The whole issue of 2,000-pound bombs. Actually, I actually there's a line of thinking. There was an American Army officer who wrote about the paradox of precision from our experience in Mosul and Syria, and actually said you actually do more damage when you try to use small diameter precision weapons because the guys escape. They go to the next building. So there's actually, and you have what he called a kind of a spider webbing of kind of destruction. Whereas, and plus you also risk the chance of losing more people. So there's all kinds of paradoxes that sometimes something that seems obvious, that you shouldn't use 2,000-pound bombs in an urban area. It all depends, and there are some times where, and I understand how Israel after October 7th after a history of kind of being actually very often very restrained and discriminate in the use of weapons, I think lowered the bar, and I think that's incontestable. But from a point of view of a country that sees itself as facing as an existential threat, what is proportional is different. So, and just the last thing I'll just say, I think some of the advice from the Biden administration, as I said before, was based on an American reading, which I think was inaccurate and not relevant. But they also gave, I think it was 18 billion in supplementals for weapons in the course of the war. So you have to see things in a holistic way. And I think there's a heavy debt of gratitude that's, to the Biden administration for overall the way the support they gave Israel in the course of the war, even if you could maybe, find, problems with some of the advice that they gave. Also, let me just also say, look, there were a time when, some Israeli critics of the conduct of the war said there was a period between, I guess, February and March, and then, July or so when Israel went into Rafah, that, the IDF kind of stood down as a result of American pressure. I think you could make an argument that in situations like that, it's just better to get the thing done over with. There's going to be unfortunate, there's no way you can fight in a heavily populated area like Gaza without grievous loss of life to non-combatants. And the sooner you finish it, the better. So American pressure might have been, in some ways, been contrary to what we were trying to accomplish there. But anyhow, you can't, I think, fault the administration for its fundamental support for Israel during the war.
All righty, Jonathan, you're next. I see you're up.
Yeah, just one point that Mike raises, I want to, and I'm no means an apologist for the Biden administration. I've never served in the Biden administration, but when it came to U.S. advice on the day after and how to deal with Hamas, I think the public talking points and perhaps even the in the room private talking points might have been sort of kludgy and unappealing or otherwise not so compelling. But I do think there's a very true case to make that U.S. arguments at the time about working to build governance and security institutions in Gaza that could displace Hamas were sound. And I think that's reflected in the fact that at the MOD and IDF level throughout the war, there was a tremendous amount of planning on this issue. And there were even some attempts, some of this was publicly reported, to create bubbles in areas where there were alternative governance and security models in and around Gaza City when those areas were otherwise more under the sphere of the IDF's influence. And I do think, I'll put a finer head on it, that ultimately, in some respects, Israel in that regard has tied its own hands because, and it's not really just the personality or the politics individually of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the fundamental political undercurrent of the government and over time, I think a broader swath of Israel's polity is, I would say, hostile towards the governance of the Palestinian Authority. And in a world where we're looking at the menu of options in the Middle East, and it's not a choice between foie gras, tuna tartare, and the rack of lamb. It's most catastrophic to let's cross our fingers, and clearly this is not as bad, but not great, is the range. There really isn't any answer for governance in Gaza unless it's going to be the Israelis themselves or the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian Authority by another name or rebranded or reformed. But right now there is a government in charge. And again, some of these tendencies, bleed out into the opposition as well, or elements of the opposition, where the idea of restoring the Palestinian Authority to Gaza or any Palestinian governance to Gaza is inimical to their ideological interests. It's not a secret that these are things that individuals like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir have been overt about. The idea of putting Palestinians back in charge of Gaza runs counter to their ideological pursuit of the reoccupation and annexation of Gaza, right? So I think we can, call a spade a spade. And so in that sense, the political undercurrents absolutely have had a constraining impact on what I would say is the military's ability to be successful. Now, at the same time, I don't. Well, I want to be careful. I don't. I recognize that those are real things, and people might say, "Oh, politics or their ideologues." You know, understand the cognitive dissonance of Secretary Austin going to Israel and saying, "You need a strategy for the day after. You need to get to some place that is otherwise sustainable." And at the same time, at the time, we had some number of U.S. troops in Syria for a counter ISIS mission, which was completely divorced from a sustainable objective for Syria. And the moment that those U.S. troops would be withdrawn, all of our gains in Syria would disappear overnight. An understanding because the politics wouldn't let the United States have a more robust Syria strategy that involved either occupying the country, replacing Assad, doing whatever, working with some of the groups that have now been empowered because they are terrorists. We politically had our own hands tied. We had no problem explaining what right looked like to the Israelis, irrespective of some of their political undercurrents and confinements, while sort of not even seeing the fact that we suffer from the same political frames as limiting our ability to plan strategically in military operations.
All righty, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to put forward a question from the audience, and this is from, if I'm not mistaken, this is a formidable graduate of ours with a minor in Israel studies who's now consulting in DC. I don't want to name names, but I think it's him. And he asked, and I think this is something that Shoshana touched upon, and he says the following: the current American defense industrial base leaves much to be desired, be it cost, scale, etc. In comparison, he says, the Israeli DIB, the defense industrial base, is remarkably agile. Are there any lessons learned or best practices that Washington can adopt from Jerusalem? The learning process from one another? This is something that, Shoshana, you touched upon earlier.
Simple answer, absolutely yes. And that it's being done. That Israel has changed the way we do some things. We have changed the way Israel has done some things. And yes, that's absolutely, and particularly now when you have people who are heavily invested in this administration in making things more tighter, more cost-effective, and all that that's an area, in my opinion, that they can work together on. I just want to say one thing about what Jonathan said, and Michael also. Advice that the U.S. gives to Israel, including military advice, and I spent years of my life taking American military officers to Israel. I did more than 35 trips. We're not the same. We're democratic countries. We have the same interests, freedom, whatever we are. But when the United States ran into one of those snags that Jonathan pointed out, you had ISIS fights in Iraq and Vietnam, if you want to go back, and even Korea, we went home. We left. We went home. Sometimes it worked out okay. Mostly it didn't work out okay. The Korea thing worked out okay for the South Koreans. Vietnam was a disaster. Iraq was a disaster. The Taliban, $6 billion worth of stuff. But we can go home, and Israel is home. So when we give them advice, go a little softer, go a little lighter, take more care of the civilians, plan the day after. It's a lot harder for people who are living on top of it. And my last thought is the most successful extraction of nasty, vicious, disgusting ideology. The U.S. was not making plans for Nazi Germany in 1942, 3, 4. We went there, we occupied them, we changed their rules. We changed their constitution, we changed their laws, we changed their education system. Ditto, Japan. We took away their emperor, we did this. Both countries were much better places for that process. Not saying that Israel should occupy Gaza, I am not. But I would point out that the U.S. experience is that we did a heck of a job after World War II and much less of a job in every case after that, with possibly the sole exception of Grenada.
So just to recap, because we have a question, and I'm going to put it both for Michael and Jonathan. Somebody asked from the audience, well, so what's the future like? You talked about the day after. What does the day after look like? Is it the plan that was put forward by Trump just a couple of weeks ago to transfer the Gazan population? Is there a clear vision that is both acceptable to Democrats and Republicans? Is it still bipartisanship all the way? Does politics not stop at the water's edge now more than ever? What is it now? How is it moving forward from here? Michael, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I have a unsatisfactory answer, which I don't have the answer for that, and I don't think anybody does. That's part of the problem, because the president threw out an idea which I think was a provocation in order to get other people to put forward their ideas more than anything else. Because I don't know if it's if it's realistic, how you implement his plan, but that still leaves Palestinians in the West Bank and in their diaspora, and that doesn't end the conflict. So you still have a conflict. I think part of the problem, and actually this is something which I'm writing on. Our approach is kind of like a kid with a Rubik's cube and always trying to align the different colors and find a formula or bridging proposals and stuff like that. And we're really that kind of diplomacy is run its course. And what you need is cultural change. And you need cultural change by Americans and American diplomats, the way they do business. You need cultural change. I mean, the Ron Dermer and Prime Minister Netanyahu has talked about de-radicalization. I don't think that's the right term, because it has to do with actually, Palestinism, and the whole, a whole national identity which is defined in opposition to another national identity, and which is part, and it's much bigger than this, because there's also kind of this kind of ecosphere which feeds it, of NGOs and political parties around the world, and then also in Israel too. We have to also acknowledge now, the Overton window, to use that term, since we're in an academic audience. What is this? What is the river to the sea crowd in Israel is pretty much still on the margins, even though they play an important role in the current government. But that's the mainstream of Palestinian politics. Although if you look at polling data, there still is maybe a 20 or 25% or at best 30% group which is willing to coexist maybe with a Jewish state and accept a two-state solution as an endpoint. So there's a lot of need for change among the Palestinians, but also in Israel too, because it's a conflict and the two sides feed each other to some extent, even though it's not a symmetrical conflict, I would argue, ideologically. So that's that cultural change takes time, although it happens faster today than it did in the past. But that's what we have to think about, looking towards the future. But people can change. It's a matter of choice. It's leadership, but it can be done, but it's very hard.
Absolutely. Jonathan, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick, just a little bit. I think in some respects it might be a better news story than the one Michael tracks. I've seen polling from as recently as September of this past year that indicated, again, one poll, the numbers move, but as many as, I think it was, around 50% of West Bank Palestinians, they wouldn't call it a two-state deal, but basically said if a Palestinian state was created along the 1967, what I would call the green line, the armistice lines, not the borders. I don't refer to them as borders. They were, we can talk about the history. Would you be okay? Basically, would that be good? And they said, yeah. So, I think, there is actually, some hope there. Of course, contrast that to the horrendous images of 18-year-olds streaming out of Gaza on October 7th, calling home, frantic and excited that, mom, dad, I just had the chance to kill Jewish dogs, referring to people. So, there is a tremendous amount of work to do, as Michael says. I just want to put in a plug. We've got a couple reports coming out in hopefully weeks. One actually written by my fantastic research assistant, an alumni of the Washington Institute, Delaney Soliday, and a former intern, looking actually sort of at the near-term ways that you can supplant Hamas ideology in Gaza. It's a great paper. I look forward to seeing it in print. And then I have a paper coming out looking a little bit further afield at some of the larger aftermath, and with some focus on how you move forward in the conflict. I do think that there's an intermediate opportunity to do things that are beneficial to Israeli security and things that are beneficial to Palestinian lives without talking about peace or two states, and doing so in terms that are otherwise conducive to the political moment in both entities. In the case of Israel, I think President Herzog's comments at Davos, I think, were a great representation of the zeitgeist, where he basically said, "I'm a lifelong supporter of the two-state solution." After October 7th, and I'm paraphrasing, that belief was largely shaken. And to get back to it, I need some sort of recognition from my neighbors about the horror that was October 7th and that it cannot happen again. And I think that's largely irrespective of politics. I think the broad center of Israel out definitely resembles those remarks, as they would say. So when we talk about creating Palestinian security forces that can work with Israel, we don't talk about it because we should be able to one day achieve this lofty goal of a two-state solution. We talk about it because the opportunity cost of the IDF doing 600 operations a month in Jenin unilaterally is inimical to Israel's security interests. Those forces and those resources can be better spent against other threats if we can build partners that can close the space to many of the violent groups that have enjoyed Iranian support in the northern part of the West Bank, and similar goes for Gaza as well. So I'll leave it at that.
There's a bunch of questions out there, and I'm trying to figure out a way to to integrate them into something that is more cohesive. Shoshana, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes.
A brief one before I ask my question or their question?
I do want to go back to Jonathan's point. First of all, there was a Palestinian security force that worked with the Israeli forces, and it collapsed after the Second Intifada, during the Second Intifada, when they were found to be fighting on the wrong side. But also something Michael said, that things need to change and attitudes need to change. I think Michael's absolutely right. President Trump threw out something that he knew perfectly well wasn't going to work. But look what happened after he did it. You had 7 Arab countries and Saudi Arabia this week meeting to discuss how, what, when. And that is prelude to a meeting of the Arab League that is coming up early in March. So I think you can get people. Nobody thought the Abraham Accords was coming either. Okay. There was something called the Vision for Peace in January of 2020. It took them 9 months to get to the Abraham Accords after that. So I'm going to end up being an optimist here and say that you have Arab states participating now. And if they can figure out how to recognize what UN Resolution 242 gave to Israel, which is that the secure and recognized boundaries free from threats or acts of force, and the legitimacy and permanence of all the states in the region. Those are still Israel's bottom lines. If the Arab states can bring people, including Palestinians, to that, might be okay. I do agree with Michael. Things have to change. The old ways don't work. You've got to find a new way.
All righty. I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to try to integrate a couple of questions with your permission. I know your time is very valuable. The Middle East, like the world perhaps, is once again a domain of great power competition. How do you see the relationship between the Middle East, that particular region, and elsewhere, and other regions around the world? For example, somebody asked about Taiwan. Somebody mentioned Taiwan earlier. Do the Chinese leaders learn something? Are they trying to learn to extract any insights? What about Russia and Ukraine? Do we see kind of cross-boundary, cross-regional learning processes here? I think that yes. Jonathan, you want to say, or just yes is fine?
Well, no, yeah, I mean, I'll give just one quick anecdote. Presumably, the Iranians took an Israeli UAV off the battlefield at some point in place in either Lebanon or Syria, and then presumably we can assume that weapon was brought back to Isfahan and then exploited, and lo and behold, we see surprisingly similar models now being produced in North Korea. So absolutely, I mean, there is no question that these partners, this axis, is engaged in supporting each other for their own parochial reasons in each area of the world. The Russians seek to dominate Europe. North Korea and China have their own parochial objectives in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, Iran is Iran. And so it's absolutely the case that we will see these partners provide both economic and military support to each other in support of those parochial goals.
Michael, a question to you with your permission. How do you see the regional setting, the political forces in the region, right? There was a recent summit in Riyadh. There's going to be some more intra-Arab conversations. Is that something meaningful? Can there be something out from that, something viable for the future of the Gaza Strip and beyond?
No, I'll just say that every war creates a new status quo, and you've got usually 18 months or 2 or 3 years before the forces that the war set loose sweep it away, unless you are able to somehow kind of find a way to reinforce that status quo through political arrangements and like. So we're seeing now, in Gaza, I don't know. I'm not optimistic about the prospects for a kind of new political arrangements there. But Lebanon, we're seeing maybe new arrangements that might constrain Hezbollah for at least for some time. Also, Hezbollah is short of money, and with maximum pressure back on Iran's ability to provide money to Hezbollah, and also, the Axis, so-called Axis of Resistance, have been trying to bring money to Hezbollah in Lebanon and through the airport, and the authorities in Lebanon have been preventing that. There's no longer a cooperative government in Syria that allows Damascus to be used for a resupply of Hezbollah. So there are ways at least to constrain Iranian regional power and its ability to rebuild and to help its proxies, and most importantly Hezbollah, to reconstitute itself. And that in itself is important. You have, again, a new government in Syria. This is big. I mean, this is a very big achievement. Whether the government will turn out to be, kind of a disappointment because of its jihadist past remains to be seen. I tend towards skepticism on these kind of things, but and Iran is now in a position where the table has been turned on them dramatically in the last few months. But again, I'll just say Iran is a country that 40 years ago looked at the region and was strategically lonely. They didn't have a superpower patron, although because of their ideology, they don't really want a superpower patron because the Soviet Union was as bad as the United States from their point of view. And they created an alliance network from scratch, Hezbollah. And then because of the civil war in Syria, they were able, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq, they were able to create popular mobilization forces, these militias under their control, and then with the Houthis because of the war in Yemen. So what they did was very impressive, and in a short period of time, the underpinnings of at least some of this regional architecture has been collapsed. So this is a big achievement. Now, whether we'll be able to, kind of nail it down and reinforce these achievements and further, push Iran kind of back and roll back its influence remains to be seen. But every war creates opportunities for both parties. And so we'll see. I don't know. Much depends on American diplomacy and what the Israelis do and how they handle the opportunity and whether they use this opportunity wisely.
Right, I got you. Shoshana, there's a question here, and I'm going to kind of piggyback on that. There's a lot of conversation now in Israel about Egypt, and there's a lot of news coming out from the Sinai about redeployment and reinforcing Egyptian forces in the region. Is Egypt a force for good?
No. I mean, Egypt is already violating the Camp David Accords. They've moved forces into the Sinai that are beyond what they were permitted to have by the Camp David Accords. Now, there was a time that Israel was helping Egypt in the northern Sinai deal with ISIS and permitted Egypt to bring those forces in, and they worked together, and they did a very good job together. Egypt's great fear, correct fear, absolutely reasonable fear, is the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's what Hamas is. And therefore, Egypt will do as little as possible and perhaps nothing to allow Palestinians to settle in Egypt because they believe that all of them are Muslim Brotherhood. I don't believe they're all Muslim, but I understand the fear of Egypt. But that keeps Egypt from being a particularly helpful force in the region, it has to say no from its point of view. It has to say no because that's its greatest fear. Now, this is why, again, I go to these meetings that are coming up, the one they had in Saudi and the one they're going to have with the Arab League. If Egypt feels that the other Arab states are helpful, are going to protect it, that Israel will protect it, and Israel has done that in the past. You don't know where Egypt is going to end up. But right now, Jordan shares that fear, by the way, that Egypt has. So you can't look to them. It's a mistake to look to them as real helpful players. They're not, and they can't be. And maybe they will be in the future, but somebody else has to step up and be the real helpful player. And I love Michael's. I agree with everything you said there, Michael. I would just add that when Iran was building its regional alliances, Iraq was a big part of that. And our departure from Iraq in 2012 gave Iran so much access to everything in Iraq, and the oil and the people and the militias and all that sort of stuff. So again, we left 5,000, 6,000 miles. We came home. They stayed, and it went to hell.
Jonathan raised his hand, and I think he was taken aback by your comment about Egypt. And if I'm reading your face correctly, Jonathan, go ahead, my friend.
Sorry, I'm a terrible poker player. I think the Israelis who know themselves would disagree with the assertion that Egypt hasn't been a quintessential partner in everything that has transpired either after October 7th. And then, of course, even before October 7th, there was now public reporting that Israeli intelligence came to Prime Minister Netanyahu warning of an attack. The idea that the Egyptians won't let Palestinians in is sort of a roundabout way of ignoring the real argument is that Palestinians don't want to leave. And I think this was ultimately perhaps an assumption made by President Trump in his recent sort of Gaza Riviera discussion is that, Palestinians don't want to leave Gaza. They very much want to stay. And there is no mechanism in international law or practically, for that matter, where you can forcibly move 2.3 million people off of the Gaza Strip. So it's a non-starter.
No.
I will also just say that I haven't seen evidence to suggest that Egypt is in violation of the 1979 agreement, but what even the Israelis themselves would agree to is the fact that Israel has been in violation of the 1979 agreement ever since October 7th. And we would say with good reason. And of course, Egypt has accepted this. But the fact is that there's been much more than a brigade level force within the 3-kilometer ribbon of the Sinai border. There have been fighter aircraft flown within that same ribbon of space. Heavy armor has been deployed within the ribbon. So it is Israel that is in fact in its credible and worthy response to the attack of October 7th, been in violation with a letter of the agreement. Again, when it comes to border security with Rafah in the past few years in particular, I think that there has been a tremendous amount of coordination. And if you talk to the J5, MOD folks and the IDF folks who work with regional partners, it's hard to imagine them saying anything else.
Wait, I want to be clear. I did not mean that Egypt wouldn't let the Palestinians in a permanent way while Gaza's being rebuilt. Egypt prevented them from leaving the battlefield, and this is in violation of international humanitarian law. They would not open. You could have put a military base in northern Sinai where there was very little happening, and you could surround them with Egyptian soldiers, and you could keep them out of Cairo, and they would not let refugees leave the battlefield. And that they should be made to acknowledge. The problem of Rafah is that it was a transit point for weapons to Hezbollah, and Egypt made a lot of money that way. And that was a violation as well. So Egypt has maintained as much of the 1979 Accords as it has to maintain, and I appreciate that. And as I say, I understand Egypt's problem with permanent movement of the Palestinians out of Gaza, because that's a separate kind of issue. But when you have the war going on, and when the people are moving to the south, and when you need to move people out of the way of the war, you've got to open the border. That's what the law says. That's what they didn't do.
I mean, you could make the same argument about the Israelis, why they didn't do the same thing,
No,
right?
no, they don't have to let the enemy in. I'm sorry, that is not a requirement. That France
Well,
should have
again,
taken
is
Nazi
Hamas the
Germany's
enemy,
refugees.
or the Palestinian civilians the enemy? And I'll also argue, and basically Sami Shukri said this quiet part out loud way back in the fall of 2023, is that if I let, if Egypt lets in Palestinian refugees, they could be there forever. I mean, the
I
Israelis
I agree with
are
that.
fond of but again,
I agree with their concern.
well, and international law against refoulement would prevent them from forcibly removing them once they were there. So they have their own strategic interests to care for. I don't credit them any less than I credit the Israelis for looking out for their own strategic interests, as the United States does as well. I mean, it's a problem from hell, but I would be very careful about casting such a wide net as we're talking about refugees, as you were just a moment ago. And then when it came to Israel's security, all of a sudden they were all combatants. So, it's.
No, I didn't say that, Jonathan. What I said was Poland would not have been required in the middle of the war to take Germans, anybody's Germans. No, in the middle of the war, you don't have to take your enemy. Should Great Britain have taken German civilians? They took Jewish kids. They weren't required. The lesson here is don't start a war and expect not to pay for it. Israel had no obligation to take its enemies, particularly enemies that wander among the civilian population, and you can't decide who is who. And that's why I agree that I understand Egypt's problem with this. However, when the battle is raging, you're Egypt, you have a place to put them far away from your concerned population. Israel does not. There's nowhere to put them in Israel that they're not next to the people they went around and killed. There's no way. So, I'm not totally unsympathetic to Egypt, but I don't think they did a great job.
All righty, it's 7:19, which I anticipated we can continue with this conversation until I said 9:30 p.m. or something, and you guys were kind of skeptical, but I know you guys. I know you very well. So if you don't mind, kind of a lightning round of looking forward, what does U.S. Israel relations look like in the next 4 years? It's just a month into the Trump administration. Imagine that. It's so intense. Things are happening so quickly. What's the next big thing? What's the breakthrough event? I think that Michael is working on something now. If you don't mind, can you start us?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it depends what happens in other parts of the world. Because I said, as I mentioned before, my concern is that some of our enemies see the chaos and the things that are going on in Washington. They see this as an opportunity, and that will suck all the oxygen out of the air. And the United States, which has since 2013 or 2012, when we've been trying to rebalance to the Indo-Pacific, this will become perhaps a necessity due to wartime exigency. And in the last year and a half, we had times when there were one or two carrier strike groups, some of which came from the Indo-Pacific region, going to the Middle East. That might not be possible. So I would just say that's the first thing, and the second thing is Iran. Again, it's kind of I'm sure I'm missing something because but I think this is one of the cases where the obvious the obvious thing is what's going to preoccupy them. And the Israelis said that as a result of the strike last October, they have a year or a little bit more probably before the Iranians are able to repair their air defenses. Although I don't know why they should be able to do another strike at that point if they need more time. And also kind of repair the missile production facilities for the ballistic missiles. But I think they're going to yield to the U.S., give diplomacy a chance, but maybe by late year, it'll be it'll be kind of decision time in where things go, and things could get very interesting, I guess, at that point.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, go ahead, and then Shoshana will be the last speaker.
Thanks. Like, two quick points. One, obviously, the alligator closest to the boat, as they say, is going to be the negotiations to extend the first stage of the ceasefire and then ultimately come to agreement on a second stage. I think that's really the central focus right now on U.S. policy in the Middle East. And secondarily, and no less important in many respects, is the Iran policy. My colleagues and I wrote a series of papers in support of the Trump administration's first 100 days, things we believe they should work on. My contribution to that was a paper suggesting that in an effort to make the maximum pressure campaign, which we knew was coming, more effective, the U.S. should coordinate its position with the E3, UK, France, and Germany, which in the intervening period of the Biden years has become much more forward-leaning in wanting to take, I'd say, a harsher, more direct position against Iran. So to be more effective with maximum pressure, the forcing function there could be making the pressure campaign multilateral, which was something that was lacking with the Trump administration when they withdrew from the JCPOA. And there is a forcing function coming up later in the year. The snapback element of JCPOA is going to expire in October. So all the more reason for the U.S. to get with partners in UK, France, and Germany to come to a coordinated position on how to leverage that in support of ultimately getting to where President Trump wants to be, which is a longer, stronger, broader deal. So I think those are two key issues to watch for.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Very, very insightful. Shoshana, go ahead, my friend.
So I think you'll have intellectual understanding and agreement between the United States and Israel on those things, on Hamas at the end, on no nuclear Iran, but the devil is always in the details. And the question is, you can have an agreement that Hamas should never rule again, but what does that mean? How are you going to get rid of it? What are you going to do about it? And who's going to do it? And Iran, the president still seems to believe that there may be a way to talk Iran out of its, or pressure Iran out of its nuclear ambitions. And I suspect Israel does not agree with that. So you can have agreement here and less agreement there. And that's what I think you'll find.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful speakers. Excellent questions. I'm so sorry I couldn't ask all of them. I was overwhelmed, but I appreciate you trying to ask these questions. Please consider attending our next webinar. For more information and to register, israelstudies.umd.edu. Thank you so much, Shoshana Bryan, Michael Eisenstadt, and Jonathan Lord. You were, as I anticipated, fantastic, excellent analysis and fantastic insights. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night. Take care, my friends. Stay safe, stay nice, stay warm.